Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here in Syracuse and in central New York. And I really appreciated so much of both what Rick said and also what the governor said. The governor, in many ways, said everything that I'm going to say. But and one of the key things he said is we're really talking about our region. I'm going to talk about this idea of temperament, what well temperament means, but really and how it applies to the region. I wanted to give you an overview. You all know where you are, but it's very interesting. If you look at Syracuse, it's a fairly compact city. It sprawls a little bit, but not hugely. And then you'll see there's the farmland and open space, greenland all around it. We're going to zoom in, and here you can kind of see the texture of how the city's laid out. It's relatively low dense relative to other cities. And here we're coming into the downtown, and we see this issue about 81 bisecting the city and how important that is. And to heal that, if we can really heal that, it helps bring the city together. That is obviously a problem that many cities throughout the nation faced in the 50s and 60s and 70s as they tore themselves apart. And here we are actually looking at an overview of this building. And what you can see from the downtown is how much opportunity there is. Everywhere where you see a parking lot, if we can get enough economic development growing, then you can get higher density. Higher density leads to more walkability because there's more things you can walk to, more mixed use and more mixed income. And so there's the opportunity. The city has the ability to densify, which we think is really, really important. That's just an overview. This is a very dense city. This is a picture of Florence. The downtown of Florence was 1 square mile. And in the Renaissance period, that 1 square mile generated much of the seeds of the culture of the entire rest of Western civilization for the next 500 years. And it really shows how much, when you bring mixed use and mixed income and high density and culture and academic institutions and religious institutions, and you turn them all into a cauldron, a melting pot of ideas, how much can be generated from such a small space. I put this on the screen because one of my goals today is to give you some images of inspiration. If you have an idea of where you want to go, then you're much more likely to get there. And even if you only get halfway, getting halfway to Florence is pretty good. So part of what my goal is to encourage you in your planning processes as you think about how you're going to integrate your region and move forward. And this actually wonderful effort of the governors, which is to have these kinds of conferences and these regional planning efforts throughout the state, is to set a high goal for what you want the future of your state to be. But we have to set our futures in the context of the globe. And there are several global trends, mega trends, that affect every one of us. So in part, we're only partly in control of our own destinies. The world is rapidly urbanizing. America is already fairly urbanized. As the governor mentioned, people are moving back to cities. But by the end of the 21st century, 80% of the world's population will be living in cities, and many of them will be this kind of density. The population is growing enormously. It's currently about 7 billion. It's supposed to stabilize in 2050 or 2060, 2050, 2060 at about 10 billion people. And we do not have the plans or the infrastructure globally to be able to accommodate that yet, or the investment for it. It's also growing much more prosperous, more larger middle class, and that larger middle class is consuming enormously. And as it does, it's consuming resources and putting enormous stress on the biodiversity and the environment of the earth. And that's actually, as we know, completely unsustainable. So we have to figure out how we're going to urbanize and grow and yet have a lower impact on the earth and create economic development while doing that. I'm going to talk about ways to do that a little bit later, but to me that is really, really key, because we have seen in the past when the climate has changed and there's been excess consumption and great income inequality, and every civilization that has had those characteristics has had a collapse. And I don't want us to have a collapse. I mentioned the climate is changing. This is a typical day of air in Beijing. This is Tiananmen Square. They have this TV screen to kind of remind people that somewhere in China, theoretically, there's blue sky. We've seen, obviously, tsunamis and hurricanes come from the climate disruptions, brutal winters, power outages. As a matter of fact, The United States per population, I actually believe, has the highest rate of power outages. They're mini ones, and they're just little bits here and there, but continuously we have a very, very weak grid of almost all nations in the world. We are seeing droughts. We're seeing a much the weather patterns are changing because of climate change, much more intense rains and much fewer rains and water. And we're also, so that's all this climate volatility. We're also seeing an enormous amount of financial volatility. We obviously had the financial crisis, but there's an enormous amount of financial uncertainty in the world, and that actually makes it very difficult to plan. And then finally, we have war all over the place, many caused by climate issues or other social tensions. And these are refugees in Syria. There are 60 million refugees around the world today, and there'll be more and more being displaced from their communities and seeking to come to communities like this. So all these trends are going on throughout the world. In the United States, we have another one, which is two, which are increasing income inequality, which is very, very disturbing. And the second one is that inequality is based on geographic and locational inequality. This is a map of the United States. The deeper the red, the poor, these are by counties, the poorer a chance, the less a chance a child will do better than their parents. And if their parents are currently at the 25th percentile of income, which is pretty low, those in the red areas, their children will even be poorer than they are when they grow up. And that is not the American dream. I really believe, remember I said we all need a vision, that part of the vision that needs to encompass all the regional planning, we do all the smart growth planning, is that we must have the dream that our children will do better than we will have the opportunity. They may or may not, but they will have the opportunity to do better than we can. And we have to understand where inequality exists in the landscape of American opportunity, and we need to overcome that. Here's a close-up. This happens to be the area around New York City, and what you can see, interestingly, is that if a child moves, when they're 3 years old, moves to the Bronx, in most places in the Bronx, they're likely to have a less good future than their parents. And if they move to, for example, Bergen County, they're going to do 50% better in terms of life income than their parents. This has a lot to do with the school system, health system, etc. What's so interesting is that in Finland, which has the best education system in the world, every school is equally as good. It doesn't matter whether you live in the richest neighborhood or the poorest neighborhood. Every child gets the same education, and we deserve that in our communities. I mentioned, again, we're subjective to global trends, so the McKinsey projects by 2025, 2 billion people will live in cities. That actually the GDP of cities will double. The middle class is also going to double. But what's interesting is that of the global 600 most important economic cities in the world, at the time of the recession, 380 were in the developed world. By 2025, there'll only be 250. So the emerging markets are where the new cities are coming from. And from the United States, we had 190 of the top 600 cities. And by 2025, they project that we're only going to have 125 of the world's top 600 cities. So we're losing. We have many, many regions in the United States that they may be even doing a little better compared to how they were doing before, but in the global context are dropping off the map. And one of the things I'm going to talk about is how we get back on the map. So these are all the issues. These are just some of the issues, but they're global issues. And as I said, every local community has to deal with these trends that are much larger than they. I mean, there's nothing that we in this region in central New York can do about globalization. We can all make our contribution to climate change, but we alone cannot stop it. So I wrote a book and did a lot of thinking about how do we solve this. And I was inspired by an extraordinary piece of music, Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier. It's a deeply spiritual piece of music, too. And it came from a very interesting combination of an operating system change and a technology change. And those are two of the keys of what we need. The operating system change was that starting about 2,000 years ago, Pythagoras, 2,500 years ago, said that he observed that the ratio of the planets was exactly the same as the ratio between notes. They called it the music of the sphere. And he said, that's the way you're supposed to tune an instrument. And ever since then, until about 1600, every instrument in Western civilization was tuned in this ratio. And it led to really perfect music in one scale, but each scale was slightly out of tune with the others, and so you could never play two different scales, two different keys, switch from one key to another because it sounded horrible. But people said, well, that's the way Pythagoras said it was supposed to be. And then a new tuning system came out of China and through Europe. In about 1600, we developed this idea of temperament, which was tuning, compromising, frankly, tuning in between the perfection of the individual scales. And all of a sudden, this new tuning system or operating system allowed every note on the keyboard, every note to be played in one magnificent harmony. And Bach took this and he created this amazing piece of music, the well-tempered clavier. The second thing was the clavier, which is the forerunner of the piano, was invented. We didn't have an instrument like this before. So with this new technology, this new operating system, he created this incredible piece of music. And just like, this is his hand, look at the notes, just see how they go up and down. And his vision, his goal was actually to understand the entire architecture of the universe and map it in music and give you, the listener, a sense of that wholeness. So really beautiful and large aspiration. And that's the aspiration, by the way, I have for our cities. Can our cities and regions actually try and map the extraordinary, beautiful, and wholeness and generative capacity of nature herself and create places where just as nature can thrive, that we can thrive? And so I've taken this idea of integration that came from the well-tempered clavier. Now, the environmental issues of the United States are framed by NEPA, which is a National Environmental Protection Act, which was passed in 1970. And I just want to read it to you. Congress, recognizing the profound impact of man's activity on the interrelations of all components of the natural environment, particularly the profound influences of population growth, high-density urbanization, industrial expansion, resource exploration, and new expanding technological advances, recognize the critical importance of restoring and maintaining environmental quality to the overall welfare and development of man, declares that it's the continuing policy of the federal government to create and maintain the conditions under which man and nature can exist in productive harmony and fulfill the social, economic, and other requirements of present and future generations of Americans. This create and maintain the conditions under which man and nature can exist in productive harmony. Such a fantastic goal. And if you think about where we are from 1970 to today, how much we have failed to achieve this goal. So I want to put that goal. Remember I said we should set big goals. And one of the reasons why is because what came out of NEPA was exactly the opposite of what the governor talked about integration. This is a couple of books from a large environmental impact statement. What NEPA generated was this environmental impact statement process. It is not a planning process. It's the way we make environmental decisions. And the process is divided into a whole bunch of entirely separate chapters that don't interrelate, that don't correlate. It is a process that actually, like the pre-tempered music, puts us in these little silos that don't speak to each other. And we need to co-create an entirely new planning process. I'm going to talk to you about how we can do that, that actually weaves the patterns together, that integrates, that does many of the things that the governor is talking about. And I don't know if we can do that under NEPA, or we need something, and SEQA or something else to do that, but we need a new way of functioning as environmental planners. And here's the way I see it. We need to start with a vision, and out of that vision grows a plan. We need to develop, there's a whole field called developing community health indicators. I'm going to show you some of them. We need to measure what we are doing. How well are we doing with the environment? How well are we doing with job creation? Are our kids doing better in school? Are our seniors aging better, and are they healthier, etc.? Really identify what matters to us. We need to measure it, and we have amazing tools to measure today. We have the Internet of Things. Each one of us who's carrying around a smartphone is measuring data all the time. We have our public health system has data. Our private systems have data. We have traffic systems. Google Earth is giving us data. We can take all that data, and we can use it to see where we are. And then government has the following tools. It has regulations. And we have excessive regulations in some areas, but regulations can protect us, they can guide us. Regulations, like think about building codes, set the minimum health and safety for us. We can invest. You heard a lot about the investment in this region. Invest in mass transit, invest in clean infrastructure, invest in new energy systems, and government can really lead with that. We can create incentives like tax breaks, et cetera, to also guide what we want. And it takes leadership too. So you've got a plan, you've got a vision, you have indicators, you use the tools of government, but instead of using them in a static way, which is the way we've done it in the past, you use them dynamically. You're continually measuring. Let's say we want more affordable housing. You're measuring your percentage of affordable housing. You're adjusting your the degree to which you're providing subsidies, et cetera, so that you're continually evolving the conditions towards the ones you want. So you measure, you compare, you co-evolve, and you check back with your vision, and that's a dynamic system that is not provided for. The goal's provided in NEPA, but the solution's not provided in NEPA. And this is what I hope under the governor's vision we can co-create. So here's a vision, by the way. The people of Portland, Oregon got together, they created a community vision, and then they did this image. I'm going to walk you through it. You see, for Portland, that building in the center is a fairly dense building. On its roof, it's got windmills. Actually, urban windmills don't work very well, but it was a symbol that they wanted green power. Look in the street. On the far left, you'll see a streetcar, and then you see a regular automobile, you see a bus, you see a bike lane, you see people walking. So what they've said is, we want everything. We want transportation choice. You see street trees on the far right. You see somebody who is selling locally grown food from nearby farms. On the far left, you see a park with people playing. So they're saying we want high density and green space in urban parks and gardens. They have laid out in this one image a sense of what, remember the governor said the taxi test, when you go into a place, so when everybody in a community has a vision of where they want to go, that's communicated, and then people also know how to get there. So in the planning that I hope will come out of this, one of the things I really encourage you to do is to do some visions. I'm going to give you another one. Our company did some work many years ago in East Hampton on affordable housing, and people said there's no place to put it. So this is Route 27. I don't know how many people have ever been to East Hampton and seen Route 27. It's an enormous traffic jam. So this must have been taken Sunday morning or something. In the middle of the winter. It is, you can see from the trees, it was in the middle of the winter. So what they said, the people said is, look, we want trees, we want a sidewalk. If you look at the original condition, there's actually it's impossible to walk. We want a bike lane. And then we separate the bike lane, and we can build local serving retail, because the retail's all gotten too expensive and small shops don't have a place to go, with affordable housing above. And when the people saw this image, everybody who said we have no place to build affordable housing said, we do have places to build affordable housing, and we love that image. That's what we want. That looks like what we want. And that's the goal of this planning process, is to give people a vision of something that is better. And you know, what's interesting is we can only build our way to a better future. You can't deny, NIMBYism in denying our way to a better future, as the governor said, leaves us where we are. I mentioned community health indicators. Santa Monica created this sustainability index. Many, many communities have. And if you just look, it's at some of the numbers, I encourage you to look these up online. Very interesting. There are categories like teenage suicide and number of people riding bicycles and affordable housing index. And they get very, very granular. And different constituents have said, this is what matters in my community, the mental health of my community, the physical health of my community. And when you put all these together, they give you an overall framework, and then you can map them and you can see how well the community is doing or not doing. And this mapping of the data and making it clear to everybody also enables people to galvanize and say, legislatures to galvanize, community groups to galvanize, private sector to galvanize and say, here's where we're doing great, here's where there's a gap and we can fill in. So that the community is always evolving towards its best self. There is a company in California called Urban Footprint that has developed this fantastic national program that takes all that data, and then it's a little hard to read, but on the left side there's scenarios. So you can create scenario planning, and one of the ones they've often done, they did a project called Envision Utah for the metro region around Salt Lake City. And one of the things they did is they said to people, well, let's look at some different futures. One is just keep growing and sprawling the way we are. Another one is densifying. Another way, they had many different futures, and then you can actually look at the data of the different futures and map what their economic impacts are. What you learn is that people didn't realize this initially, but that sprawl is much more costly than density. Think of it this way. Every time you put in a sewer system, for every, say, 100 feet of pipe, if it's serving 10 families, it's a lot more cost effective than it's only serving a half a family. So running through the economics, running through the climate impacts, the social impacts, the school impacts of these different scenarios, they're able to evaluate the outcomes, which then help people make better decisions. And we do believe that this process is not top-down. Again, as the governor said, it is a community-based planning process. And when the communities get themselves, when people, neighbors get together and really, you've given them the tools of the data, you've given them they've helped co-create a vision, we find that time and time again, they're always recommending the best decisions. I'm going to talk a little bit about infrastructure because it's one of the very important things the government can do. This is a map that I made up. This is no official map, and it is a suggested high-speed rail system. And what it says is if we could connect New York City, Boston, Albany, Syracuse, Rochester, Buffalo, and Toronto, and on the other side, take it to Montreal. If you could connect all these into a high-speed regional system. Remember I said that there's about 65 cities that are going to fall off the global map. And the reason they're going to fall off the map is because they're not connected. And when you connect these cities together, so that the regions, in effect, are then becoming a super region. And the intellectual capital of amazing places like Syracuse University and Rochester and the medical school, for example, at Buffalo is one of the best in the country. And yet, it's a little bit off the map. When you can connect that by high-speed rail to Boston, you all of a sudden create a super network that has enormous economic power, intellectual power, and we believe competitive capacity. This is something that needs obviously federal money. It's beyond what a state can finance. But this kind of transportation vision, I think, is critical for bringing central New York and making it a preeminent region in the world. And China has done this, by the way. They have high-speed rail everywhere. I've written it's amazing. It works, and cities that used to be quite far apart, when you just make them an hour or two apart, get back on the map. I'm going to talk to you more about infrastructure, and that's the idea of a circular economy. Today, the way Western civilization works is every city in the world imports stuff. We import energy, we import food and fiber and construction materials. They go through the city, and within 6 months, 98% of that material leaves the city as waste. This is not the way nature works. Nature works in loops, in cycles. So, for example, we know trees breathe in carbon dioxide and out oxygen. We breathe in oxygen and out carbon dioxide, and we're in a cycle. We all learned that, I think, in elementary school or junior high school. And yet we don't design systems that work that way. So remember I said we got a population of 10 billion people coming. They're consuming more. That's a disaster if you're a linear system. It's fantastically generative if you're a circular system. So we can, I'll show you some examples, but we can take in cities of Minneapolis, for example, is already doing this. They're linking buildings together to take their waste heat from one building and loop it to the next building and use it to heat the building or convert it into cooling. We can create districts that recycle our heat. We can recycle, I'm going to show you, stormwater and wastewater. We can, organic waste, San Francisco recycles, highest recycling rate in the world. Recycles 80% of its waste. They're going towards 100%. And they take every bit of organic waste, which is separated. They have a culture about this. And they compost it, by the way, in a co-op that creates about 400 jobs. And then it's spread by the farmers, amazing Napa Valley and Sonoma Valley farm systems, so that it creates amazing food that comes back to the system. It's a whole cycle. We take solid waste and turn it into construction materials, etc. So the more we think about circular economies, now here's the amazing thing about circular economies. All of a sudden the jobs are local. All of a sudden the environmental impacts disappear. And the jobs are local creating these systems, and the jobs are local maintaining these systems. So as you think about future infrastructure investments, think about how circular can you make them to be. This is the water treatment plant in Windhoek, Namibia. Namibia is a desert city in Africa. It was rapidly growing and has no water, very, very little water. This is the first city in the world over 40 years ago. They took their wastewater, their sewer water. They treated it perfectly, and they cycled it back and put it into the drinking side. And because of that, this is Windhoek today. It's grown to be a fantastic city, and it has enough water for this growth that it has sustained. And there's not been a single accident. The engineer who created this system said you have to judge water not by its history, but by its quality. And we're seeing these systems now beginning to emerge around the world. It's a circular water system. And in places that are facing increasing droughts, this is part of the solution. This happens to be a water treatment plant outside of Washington. What's so interesting is it is taking the biggest constituent in urine is nitrogen and phosphorus. And we spend all this money taking it out of plants. They're taking it out of the plant, but that's exactly what fertilizer is making. And they're taking it out of the plant for $100 a ton, and they're selling it for $400 a ton. It's become a profit center. There are water treatment plants now that are energy plants because they take all of the methane from the composting and they turn that into electric generation. So they're not just waste treatment plants, they're electric generators and fertilizer factories. Again, you can begin to see what happens when you think about circular systems. We also, but again, the new world has to be a distributed system. We have the big stuff like I've described, high-speed rail, that's a big system. But we have to connect it to smaller systems and smaller systems. There's a building we did in the South Bronx called Villa Verde where we collect the rainwater, purify it, and reuse it. We can also, another low-income project in Harlem where we collect sunlight, solar, and we use it. This is a building, the Bullitt Foundation offices in Seattle, where the building was designed to generate more of everything than it uses. So you can see this big solar array on the roof. It actually generates more electricity than it needs. It collects all of its rainwater, purifies it, reuses it. It takes all its wastewater and reuses it. So this building actually exudes pure water back to the city system. It's a net positive building. So we can begin to connect. We can think of these microgrids of water and wastewater and energy and heat, where things are coming from many sources, from solar and wind and batteries, and from regular gas-fired power plants, and the waste heat of buildings and battery storage, and you tie it all together, and you get a much more resilient system. Remember I said we have storms coming, heats, droughts, power outages, all that stuff. When you have, that system is very vulnerable. But when it's highly distributed and you have all these pieces, a few pieces could break, but the system doesn't break. So this distributed system turns out to be cheaper, much lower environmental impact, creates many more local jobs, and is much more environmentally resilient. The last thing I want to talk about is the social resilience, creating resilience for human communities. There's an idea called developing communities of opportunity. And what we have understood is that for a family to really thrive, remember I started this talk by saying the American dream is about opportunity, and we need to equalize the landscape of opportunity in our regions. And the way to do it is these 9 components. It has to start with affordable housing. Every bit of social science now shows us that if a family does not have a stable base of healthy, affordable housing that they can afford, everything else is very, very difficult. We know this correlates to health outcomes, to education outcomes. There are 20 million American families today that spend more than 50% of their income on housing, and that leaves almost nothing left. We know that we need great education systems, great healthcare systems, parks and open space, neighborhood-serving markets, arts and culture, mass transit, multiple means of transit, and jobs. And finally, we actually need places of reflection and spirituality. And all those components are necessary for healthy communities. And again, we can map how well we are doing or not doing and know where we need to focus. This is a state-funded project called The Prelude in White Plains that our company built of affordable housing on the site of previous affordable housing. This is so in regions there'll be many forms. There'll be a downtown form that is more urban like that. There'll be a suburban form that is high density but lower and greener. This is a project we happen to have built in Denver. And we need to take old public housing. This is a project we did in Wallingford, Connecticut, and we need to revitalize that. That is an actual before and after. As the governor mentioned, he's started his redevelopment career in affordable housing, and then as Secretary of HUD really focused on the program to recreate public housing. As we said, we need great schools. And the schools, you can see in this image, this is a school called Harlem RBI, which we built in Harlem. And you can see that there's a screen that actually connects it to classrooms around the world, that it's connected a beautiful, even though it's urban, it's got daylight and a park outside. We need lively downtown streets with activity at the street level and shops above and affordable housing above. These are some Central Valley community, Central region communities. As I mentioned, we need multiple modes of transit. This is actually a streetcar in Buffalo, and we have zip cars, and we have bicycles and bike share, and we need to weave all these things together on the transit side. We've learned how much parks and open space are critical to resilience. The more we weave nature back into the city, the happier people are. There's actually studies that show that people are much healthier when they live adjacent to nature. And then finally, the more resilient the regions are to storms. And this happens at many, many levels where we certainly need to bring parks back to our waterfronts. We need to create green streets which absorb stormwater. We now know that with climate change coming, that streets, neighborhoods that have a lot of trees are 6 degrees cooler during hot summers than neighborhoods that are not. So they're not. And by the way, also neighborhoods that have a lot of streets, a lot of trees on the streets. Have higher economic value, which means their homes are worth more, which means they pay higher taxes. And interestingly, studies show that people have better psychological health when they live on those streets. We need to get kids, families re-engaged in community gardening. Because one of the other quadrants is healthy food. We now know how much important healthy food is to mental development. I want to talk about where some of the money can come from this. This is the amount that all the OECD nations, the top developed nations in the world, spend on healthcare. And what you'll see is the United States to the left spends far more than anybody else. What's interesting, though, is that we don't have the best return on healthcare. And if you actually, what's interesting is now this chart, so took the healthcare expenditure, the healthcare expenditure, and added on top of it, how much do we spend on pre-K education? How much do you spend on affordable housing? How much do you spend on maternity leave? How much do you spend on the other social services that, it turns out, improve health outcomes? And if you put those all together, what you learn is that the United States spends less than many other nations. Combined, they spend much more. Now, what's also interesting is all these nations, we have about the worst health outcomes. So all that money we're spending is not doing the solution. The fact that the other nations are spending much more in affordable housing and mass transit and early childhood education and early childhood health, etc., is leading, it's a much better expenditure of money. We could take the same amount of money we're spending now, reallocate it, and get much better outcomes and have much better well-being and create much more opportunity. And the last thing I'm going to return to, this is a labyrinth, is I want to return to Bach. Because remember what I said was Bach actually had a spiritual vision. His original vision was to map the universe, his whole sense of the majesty of creation in music. And my sense is that is our responsibility with our communities. There is an incredible majesty of creation that as life we are part of. And that if we can envision and inspire that, and that life is imbued with compassion. It's imbued with relationship. It's imbued with altruism. That's at the very essence to me of what spiritual traditions are about. And the only way, I mentioned a lot of technology and a lot of planning tools and data feedback, and all those things are great ways to get there. But the only way we're really going to get there is by an altruistic intent to recognize that we are all in this together, and we are all going to work together towards a higher goal. And if we can do that, we can really create well-tempered regions. And with that, I thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rick, for your comments, and we are lucky to have you here. And Jonathan, I could listen to you forever. That should be required for everybody who participates in local governments to understand how we're all interconnected. And you talk about Bach and beauty and balance, and I get to talk about the logistics of the conference. So it's a tough act to follow.